The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle like a gray shroud, and Sergeant Thomas Whitfield felt the weight of 20 years of loyal service pressing down on his shoulders. At 45, he had served 3 monarchs, witnessed countless state ceremonies, and protected the royal family through times of both celebration and crisis. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of the unmarked vehicle as he navigated the winding roads leading away from London. A small leather package secured in the compartment beside him. The package had arrived 3 days earlier, through channels that bypassed normal Royal Mail protocols. It bore no official seals, no recognizable markings, yet something about it had caught the attention of the intelligence services. Thomas had been present when the package was intercepted, watching as officials debated its contents and destination. The address was clear, Princess of Wales, Catherine, but the sender remained a mystery, and that mystery had set in motion a chain of events that now placed Thomas in an impossible position. King Charles had been explicit in his instructions during their private meeting the previous evening. The package was to be destroyed, its contents never reaching Catherine. The king's face had been stern, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of royal tradition. Some secrets, Sergeant Whitfield, are better left buried. The stability of the crown depends on it. Thomas had nodded, accepting the order as he had countless others, but something in the king's eyes suggested there was more to this story than he was being told. The drive to Catherine's private residence should have been routine. Thomas had made similar journeys many times, delivering official correspondence and personal items between members of the royal family. But this time felt different. The package seemed to pulse with significance, and Thomas found himself questioning orders for the first time in his career. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, but which member of that family deserved his protection now? As he pulled into a secluded rest area 20 miles from his destination, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to the designated location where other security personnel waited to dispose of the package, he turned off the engine and sat in the growing darkness. The weight of his choice pressed against his chest like a physical force. He thought of his daughter Sarah and what she would say about following orders blindly versus doing what felt right. The package was small enough to fit in his jacket pocket, wrapped in brown paper that had been carefully sealed. Thomas had studied it during quiet moments over the past 3 days, noting the precise handwriting of the address and the subtle indentations that suggested important documents inside. His training told him to follow orders without question, but his instincts suggested that Catherine had a right to know what someone was trying so desperately to keep from her. Thomas had served under Catherine's protection detail for several years before his current assignment. He had watched her navigate the complexities of royal life with grace and determination, always putting duty before personal comfort. She had earned his respect through small gestures of kindness toward staff and her genuine concern for others. If someone was trying to reach her with information important enough to risk bypassing official channels, perhaps she deserved the chance to decide for herself whether to receive it. The decision crystallized in his mind as he started the engine and pulled back onto the road. But instead of heading toward the disposal site, he turned toward Catherine's residence. The consequences of his choice weighed heavily on him, but Thomas had spent too many years following orders without question. This time, he would trust his conscience over his commanding officers. The evening air was crisp as Thomas approached the gates of Catherine's private residence. Security cameras tracked his vehicle, and he knew his arrival would be logged and reported. There would be no hiding what he was about to do, no opportunity to change his mind once he crossed this threshold. His hands trembled slightly as he presented his credentials to the guard at the gate, knowing that these might be among the last times he would use them. Catherine's residence was quieter than the main royal properties, designed for privacy rather than ceremony. Thomas had visited here before on official business, but never under circumstances like these. As he parked and walked toward the main entrance, he rehearsed what he would say. How do you explain to a member of the royal family that you are defying direct orders from the king? How do you justify putting personal judgment above institutional loyalty? The butler who answered the door recognized Thomas immediately. Sergeant Whitfield, we weren't expecting you this evening. Is everything all right? The concern in the man's voice was genuine, and Thomas realized that his nervousness must be visible despite his efforts to remain composed. He asked to speak with Catherine privately, explaining that he had something important to deliver personally. Catherine appeared in the hallway 15 minutes later, dressed casually, but maintaining the poise that never seemed to leave her. Her eyes were questioning but not alarmed, suggesting she trusted Thomas enough to grant his unusual request for a private meeting. They moved to a small sitting room away from the main areas of the house, where their conversation would not be overheard by staff or security personnel. "Sergeant Whitfield, you seem troubled," Catherine observed as they settled into comfortable chairs near the fireplace. Her ability to read people had always impressed Thomas, and he realized there was no point in trying to hide his internal struggle. The package felt heavy in his jacket pocket, and he found himself wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career or finally do something truly meaningful. Thomas took a deep breath and began to explain the situation. He told Catherine about the mysterious package, the king's orders to destroy it, and his growing conviction that she had a right to know what someone was trying to tell her. Catherine's expression remained neutral as she listened, but Thomas could see the intelligence working behind her eyes as she processed the implications of what he was saying. "You understand what you're risking by bringing this to me," Catherine said quietly when Thomas finished his explanation. Her voice carried no judgment, only acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. Thomas nodded, explaining that he had considered the consequences carefully but felt that some principles were more important than following orders blindly. Catherine was silent for several long moments, staring into the fireplace as she considered Thomas's words. Finally, she looked directly at him and asked if he was certain about his decision. When Thomas confirmed that he was, she extended her hand. "Then I suppose I should see what someone was so determined to share with me." Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew the package, placing it carefully in Catherine's hands. As she began to unwrap it, he felt a mixture of relief and terror. There would be no going back now, no undoing what he had set in motion. Whatever the package contained would change things for Catherine, for himself, and possibly for the entire royal family. The brown paper fell away to reveal a slim folder containing what appeared to be photographs and documents. Catherine's face remained impassive as she began to examine the contents, but Thomas noticed her hands tighten slightly on the folder. Whatever she was seeing clearly had significance, though she gave no outward sign of distress or surprise. After several minutes of silent review, Catherine closed the folder and looked up at Thomas. Her expression was thoughtful rather than emotional, as if she were processing complex information and considering various responses. "Sergeant Whitfield, I want you to know that I appreciate your decision to bring this to me." Thomas felt a surge of relief at her words, though he knew the real challenges were still ahead. "Ma'am, if I may ask, is the information significant?" Catherine nodded slowly, explaining that the contents raised questions that would require careful consideration and investigation. She assured Thomas that she understood the risk he had taken and would not forget his loyalty. As Thomas prepared to leave, Catherine stopped him with a gentle touch on his arm. "There may be difficult days ahead for both of us," she said quietly. "Are you prepared for that?" Thomas met her gaze steadily and confirmed that he had made his choice with full understanding of the potential consequences. Some things, he explained, were more important than personal comfort or career security. The drive back to London felt different than the journey out. Thomas no longer carried the physical weight of the package, but he now bore the knowledge that he had fundamentally altered his relationship with the royal hierarchy. His phone had remained silent during the evening, but he knew that wouldn't last long. Soon, questions would be asked about his whereabouts and activities. As he navigated the late evening traffic, Thomas thought about the conversation with Catherine and her reaction to the package's contents. Her composure had been remarkable, but he had seen enough in her eyes to know that whatever information the package contained was both significant and troubling. He found himself wondering who had sent it and why they had felt the need to bypass official channels. The lights of London appeared ahead as Thomas considered his immediate future. He would report to headquarters in the morning as usual, but he knew that his actions would soon be discovered. The security logs would show his unauthorized visit to Catherine's residence, and questions would follow quickly. He had perhaps hours before his defiance became known to his superiors. Thomas thought about his daughter Sarah and what she would say about his choice. She had always encouraged him to follow his conscience, even when it meant taking difficult paths. Perhaps she would understand that sometimes loyalty meant protecting people from those who claimed to have their best interests at heart. The package had been meant for Catherine, and Catherine alone should have decided whether to receive it. As he parked outside his small flat near the barracks, Thomas felt the weight of uncertainty about tomorrow. He had served faithfully for 20 years, but that service was about to be questioned in ways he had never experienced. Yet, as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of having made a choice based on principle rather than simply following orders. The evening news played softly in the background as Thomas prepared a simple dinner and tried to process the events of the day. Soon he knew the consequences of his decision would begin to unfold, but for now, in the quiet of his own space, he could reflect on a choice that felt more authentic than anything he had done in years of unquestioning service. Tomorrow would bring challenges and possibly the end of his career. But Thomas Whitfield went to sleep that night knowing he had honored something more important than institutional loyalty. He had honored his conscience and his respect for Catherine's right to know the truth. Whatever came next, he had finally acted on his own moral compass, rather than simply following the compass provided by others. The morning alarm sounded at 5:30, just as it had for the past 20 years, but Thomas Whitfield woke with a knot of anxiety in his stomach that was entirely new. He lay in bed for several minutes, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of London awakening outside his window. Today would be different. Today he would face the consequences of his decision to deliver the mysterious package to Catherine against direct orders from King Charles. Thomas showered and dressed in his uniform with particular care, knowing that his appearance might be scrutinized more closely than usual. As he knotted his tie, he caught his reflection in the mirror and saw a man who looked older than his 45 years, worn down by decades of following orders without question. But there was something new in his eyes today, a spark of defiance that both excited and terrified him. The drive to Windsor Castle felt longer than usual, each mile bringing him closer to a confrontation he could no longer avoid. His phone had remained silent throughout the night, which surprised him. He had expected urgent calls or messages demanding explanations for his unauthorized visit to Catherine's residence. The silence was almost more unsettling than angry demands would have been. At the security checkpoint, Thomas presented his credentials as he had thousands of times before. But this morning, the guard's routine scan of his identification seemed to take longer than usual. There was a brief pause, a moment where the guard's eyes lingered on Thomas's face with what might have been recognition or concern. Then the barrier lifted, and Thomas was waved through with the usual polite nod. The Royal Protection Headquarters buzzed with its typical early morning activity as Thomas made his way to his office. Colleagues greeted him with their usual mixture of professionalism and camaraderie, showing no signs of awareness about his activities the previous evening. Thomas began to wonder if perhaps his unauthorized visit had gone unnoticed, if the security protocols he had worried about had somehow failed to flag his actions. That illusion lasted exactly 23 minutes. At 8:15, Thomas's direct supervisor, Commander Sarah Phillips, appeared at his office door with an expression that immediately told him his hopes for avoiding immediate consequences had been naive. Commander Phillips was a woman of few words and direct action, someone who had earned respect through competence rather than political maneuvering. Her presence meant serious business. "Sergeant Whitfield, I need to see you in Conference Room C immediately," she said without preamble. Her tone was professionally neutral, but Thomas caught the underlying tension. Conference Room C was typically reserved for sensitive discussions and disciplinary meetings. Thomas gathered his composure and followed her down the corridor, aware that several colleagues had noticed the summons and were watching with curiosity. Conference Room C contained 3 people when Thomas entered: Commander Phillips, Deputy Director James Morrison, and a woman Thomas didn't recognize wearing the subtle insignia of internal security. The setup immediately told Thomas that this was not going to be a routine briefing or casual inquiry. This was a formal investigation, and he was clearly the subject of interest. Deputy Director Morrison gestured for Thomas to take a seat at the conference table. Morrison was known throughout the service as a fair but uncompromising leader, someone who valued loyalty above almost all other qualities. His presence suggested that Thomas's actions had been noticed at the highest levels of the Royal Protection Service. The unknown woman opened a tablet and began what was obviously a formal recording of the proceedings. "Sergeant Whitfield," Morrison began without pleasantries. Our security logs show that you made an unauthorized visit to Princess Catherine's residence last evening at approximately 1930 hours. This visit was not part of your assigned duties and was not cleared through proper channels. Can you explain the nature and purpose of this visit? Thomas had rehearsed this moment during his sleepless hours the previous night, but actually facing the question felt different than he had imagined. The weight of 20 years of loyal service seemed to press down on him as he considered his response. He could lie, claim the visit was related to routine security matters, but that would only compound his problems when the truth inevitably emerged. "Sir, I delivered a package to Princess Catherine that was intended for her personal attention," Thomas replied, choosing his words carefully. He knew that this admission would lead to more serious questions, but he had committed himself to honesty when he made the decision to defy orders. There was no point in deception. Now the reaction was immediate. The woman from internal security looked up from her tablet with sharp interest, while Commander Phillips' expression darkened noticeably. Deputy Director Morrison leaned forward, his voice taking on a harder edge. "What package, Sergeant? And on whose authority did you make this delivery?" This was the moment Thomas had dreaded most. He took a deep breath and explained about the mysterious package that had arrived 3 days earlier, his attendance at the meeting where its disposal was ordered, and his decision to deliver it to Catherine despite explicit instructions to the contrary. The room fell silent as he finished his explanation, the gravity of his admission settling over the participants like a heavy blanket. Deputy Director Morrison's face had gone pale during Thomas's explanation. The unauthorized delivery of intercepted materials to a member of the royal family was not just insubordination. It was a potential security breach of the highest order. "Sergeant Whitfield, are you telling me that you deliberately disobeyed direct orders from His Majesty to deliver potentially sensitive materials to Princess Catherine?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied simply. There was no point in softening the truth or trying to justify his actions with elaborate explanations. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences with the same directness that had characterized his entire career. The silence that followed his confirmation seemed to stretch for minutes, though it was probably only seconds. The woman from internal security spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and professional. "Sergeant Whitfield, I am Inspector Rachel Davies from Internal Affairs. I must inform you that your actions constitute a serious breach of protocol, and potentially a violation of the Official Secrets Act. You will be suspended from active duty pending a full investigation. Your security clearance is hereby temporarily revoked, and you are restricted from contact with any member of the royal family." Thomas nodded his understanding, though the finality of Inspector Davies' words hit him like a physical blow. 20 years of service wiped away in an instant. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so baldly made it real in a way his imagination had not prepared him for. He began to remove his identification badge and service weapon, placing them on the conference table with steady hands despite the turmoil in his mind. Commander Phillips spoke next, her voice softer but no less serious. "Thomas, I've known you for 8 years. This is completely out of character. What made you think this was the right course of action?" Her use of his first name suggested personal concern beneath her professional disappointment, and Thomas felt a pang of regret for letting down someone who had been both supervisor and mentor. Thomas considered his response carefully. He could mention his growing doubts about blindly following orders, his respect for Catherine's right to make her own decisions, or his instinct that the package contained information she needed to know. But all of those explanations seemed inadequate in the face of such serious consequences. "Commander, I believe that Princess Catherine had a right to receive correspondence intended for her, regardless of institutional preferences." The answer seemed to frustrate Inspector Davies, who had clearly hoped for something more concrete to work with in her investigation. "Sergeant Whitfield, did anyone else encourage you to take this action? Have you been in contact with any unauthorized parties who might have influenced your decision?" Her questions suggested she was looking for evidence of external manipulation or corruption, scenarios that might explain his unprecedented behavior. "No, ma'am," Thomas replied firmly. "This decision was entirely my own. No one else was involved in any way." He wanted to make absolutely clear that his actions had not been part of any larger conspiracy or security breach. Whatever consequences he faced, he would not allow speculation to harm innocent colleagues or compromise ongoing operations. Deputy Director Morrison stood and walked to the window, his back to the conference table as he processed the situation. When he turned around, his expression was grim. "Sergeant Whitfield, you understand that this matter cannot remain within our department. Given the sensitive nature of the materials and the direct contradiction of royal orders, this will need to be reported to the highest levels. There may be legal consequences beyond administrative discipline." The mention of legal consequences sent a chill through Thomas that he worked hard not to show. He had considered the possibility of criminal charges, but hearing it stated explicitly made the threat real and immediate. The Official Secrets Act carried severe penalties, and his unauthorized actions could easily be construed as violations of national security protocols. Inspector Davies closed her tablet and gathered her materials, signaling that the initial questioning was complete. "Sergeant Whitfield, you will report to my office at headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for a comprehensive debriefing. Between now and then, you are not to discuss this matter with anyone, including family members. You are not to attempt contact with any member of the royal household or Royal Protection Service. Do you understand these restrictions?" Thomas confirmed his understanding and signed the formal suspension notice that Commander Phillips placed before him. As he stood to leave, Morrison spoke one final time. "Thomas, I hope you understand the seriousness of what you've done. This isn't just about following orders. The security of the royal family depends on everyone playing their assigned role without deviation. Your actions have potentially compromised that security in ways we're only beginning to understand." The walk back to his office to collect personal belongings felt like a funeral march. Colleagues who had greeted him warmly earlier in the morning now watched with curiosity and concern as he packed the few personal items from his desk. Word of his suspension would spread quickly through the close-knit community of royal protection officers, and Thomas knew his reputation was now forever changed. As he drove away from Windsor Castle for what might be the last time as a serving officer, Thomas felt the full weight of what he had lost: his career, his identity, his sense of purpose, all sacrificed for a decision that had taken less than a minute to make, but would have consequences lasting years. He thought about calling his daughter Sarah, but remembered the restriction against discussing the matter with family members. The afternoon stretched ahead of him, empty and uncertain. For the first time in 2 decades, Thomas had nowhere to be, no duties to perform, no schedule to maintain. He drove aimlessly through London, processing the morning's events and trying to imagine what his life would look like if his career in royal protection was truly over. The freedom felt more like exile than liberation. At a quiet pub in South London, Thomas ordered a pint and found a corner table where he could think without interruption. The lunchtime crowd was sparse, mostly retirees and shift workers, people who wouldn't recognize him or wonder why a man in a military-style haircut was drinking alone in the middle of the day. For the first time since making his decision, Thomas allowed himself to fully consider whether he had done the right thing. The package had clearly contained significant information. Catherine's reaction had made that obvious. But what if that information was dangerous? What if there were good reasons for keeping it from her? Thomas realized he had made his decision based on principle rather than practical considerations, and now he wondered if his principles had been misguided. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for your service to truth." Thomas stared at the message, wondering who could have sent it and how they had gotten his number. The timing seemed too coincidental to be random, suggesting someone was aware of his actions and their consequences. He deleted the message immediately, knowing that any unauthorized contact could be used as evidence against him. The afternoon wore on, and Thomas found himself walking through Hyde Park, trying to process the dramatic change in his circumstances. Families pushed strollers along the paths, children played on the playground equipment, and life continued normally around him, while his own world had been turned upside down. He thought about the sacrifices he had made for his career: missed family gatherings, relationship compromises, social isolation, and wondered if they had been worthwhile. As evening approached, Thomas returned to his flat and began the strange process of adjusting to a life without structure or purpose. He had always been someone who found meaning through service, and without that service he felt adrift in a way that was both liberating and terrifying. The silence of his phone, usually a comfort after busy days, now felt like evidence of his isolation from the community that had defined his adult life. The television news made no mention of his suspension or the events that had led to it, which wasn't surprising given the sensitive nature of royal security matters. Thomas wondered if the story would ever become public, or if it would remain buried in classified files, known only to the small circle of officials who were now investigating his actions. In some ways, the secrecy made his sacrifice feel even more profound. He had risked everything for a principle that might never be acknowledged or understood by the broader public. That evening, as Thomas prepared a solitary dinner, he thought about Catherine and whether she had begun investigating the information in the package. Whatever it contained, she was now dealing with it alone, just as he was dealing with the consequences of his decision alone. He hoped she understood that his choice had been motivated by respect for her autonomy rather than disrespect for royal protocol. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of conferences with stern officials and images of his security credentials being ceremonially destroyed. But beneath the anxiety and uncertainty, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of having acted according to his own moral compass rather than simply following orders. Whatever tomorrow brought, he had finally taken ownership of his choices in a way that felt authentically his own. The morning of Thomas's scheduled interview with Inspector Defies arrived gray and drizzling, matching his mood as he made his way to the Internal Affairs headquarters in central London. He had spent a restless night reviewing every detail of his decision to deliver the package to Catherine, trying to anticipate the questions he would face and the evidence investigators might have gathered about his actions. The Internal Affairs building was a nondescript office complex that could have housed any government department, its bland exterior designed to avoid drawing attention to the sensitive work conducted inside. Thomas presented himself at reception precisely at 9 o'clock. His military training making punctuality automatic even in circumstances like these. The security guard who escorted him to Inspector Defies' office was polite but formal, treating him with the careful neutrality reserved for subjects under investigation. Inspector Defies' office was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, suggesting a mind that valued precision and order. She gestured for Thomas to take a seat across from her desk while she reviewed a thick file that presumably contained everything known about his 20-year career and recent unauthorized actions. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she read, occasionally making notes in the margins of documents Thomas could not see. "Sergeant Whitfield," Inspector Defies began without looking up from her file. "I've spent considerable time reviewing your service record. 20 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations, 0 disciplinary actions. Your colleagues describe you as reliable, dedicated, and absolutely trustworthy. This makes your recent actions particularly puzzling." Thomas remained silent, understanding that the comment was not really a question but rather an opening statement designed to establish the contrast between his past reliability and current situation. Inspector Defies finally looked up from her file, her gray eyes studying his face with the intensity of someone trained to detect deception and hidden motivations. "Let's start with the package itself," she continued, opening a recording device on her desk. "You stated yesterday that you delivered a package to Princess Catherine that had been marked for destruction. I want you to walk me through exactly how you came to possess this package and what made you decide to disobey direct orders regarding its disposal." Thomas took a deep breath and began to recount the events of 3 days earlier when the package had first come to official attention. He described the morning briefing where intelligence services had presented their concerns about the mysterious correspondence, the debate among officials about its potential contents, and the eventual decision to intercept it rather than allow normal delivery. His account was precise and chronological, drawing on his training in incident reporting. During this briefing, Inspector Defies interrupted. "Did anyone express doubts about the decision to prevent delivery? Was there any suggestion that Princess Catherine should be consulted about the package's contents?" Her questions suggested she was looking for evidence that Thomas's actions might have been influenced by official ambivalence or conflicting guidance. "No, ma'am," Thomas replied firmly. "The decision was unanimous among all present. There was no debate about whether Princess Catherine should receive the package. He wanted to be absolutely clear that his subsequent decision had been entirely his own initiative, not the result of mixed signals or unclear instructions from his superiors." Inspector Defies made a note and continued her questioning, focusing on the specific moment when Thomas had decided to defy orders. She wanted to understand his thought process, his justification for prioritizing what he saw as Catherine's right to know over his duty to follow commands. Thomas found himself struggling to articulate feelings and instincts that had seemed crystal clear in the moment, but now felt inadequate when subjected to official scrutiny. "Inspector," Thomas said after several minutes of circular questioning, "I understand that my actions were insubordinate and potentially illegal. But I believed then, and I believe now, that intercepting personal correspondence without the recipient's knowledge or consent was wrong, regardless of official justification. Sometimes personal conscience must override institutional loyalty." The comment seemed to strike a nerve with Inspector Davies, whose expression hardened noticeably. "Sergeant Whitfield, personal conscience is a luxury that people in our position cannot afford. The security of the royal family depends on everyone following established protocols without deviation. Your personal beliefs about correspondence rights are irrelevant when national security is at stake." Thomas felt a flash of anger at her dismissive tone but kept his voice level as he responded. "With respect, Inspector, if we abandon personal conscience entirely, we risk becoming automatons who cannot distinguish between legitimate orders and abuse of authority. The package was addressed to Princess Catherine. She had a right to decide whether to receive it." The questioning continued for another hour, covering every aspect of Thomas's decision-making process and the practical details of his unauthorized visit to Catherine's residence. Inspector Davies was thorough and professional, but Thomas detected an underlying frustration with his refusal to express regret for his actions. She seemed to expect remorse or at least acknowledgement that he had made a mistake, neither of which he could honestly provide. At 11 o'clock, Inspector Davies called for a short break, leaving Thomas alone in the office while she stepped out to confer with colleagues. He used the time to study the framed certificates on her wall, noting her extensive training in counterintelligence and internal security. She was clearly someone who had built her career on maintaining institutional loyalty and detecting threats to established order. His actions must seem particularly threatening to someone with her background and responsibilities. When Inspector Davies returned, she was accompanied by a man Thomas recognized as Director General Sir Michael Thornton, the head of Royal Protection Services. Thornton's presence elevated the seriousness of the proceedings significantly, suggesting that Thomas's case had attracted attention at the very highest levels of the security establishment. The Director General's reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him, and his involvement did not bode well for Thomas's future prospects. "Sergeant Whitfield," Director General Thornton said without preamble as he took a seat across from Thomas, "I want to be very clear about something. The package you delivered to Princess Catherine contained information that could potentially damage the reputation and security of the royal family. Your decision to ignore orders and deliver this material has created a crisis that extends far beyond simple insubordination." Thomas felt his stomach drop at this revelation. Throughout his questioning, he had hoped that the package might have contained relatively benign information, perhaps personal correspondence or minor administrative matters. The suggestion that it contained genuinely damaging material cast his decision in a much more serious light and made his defiance of orders seem potentially reckless rather than principled. "Sir," Thomas asked carefully, "if the information was genuinely damaging, why was it not addressed through proper security protocols? Why was the decision made to simply destroy it rather than investigate its origins and implications?" His questions reflected his growing unease about the situation he had stumbled into and the possibility that there were layers of complexity he had not understood. Director General Thornton exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Davies before responding. "Sergeant Whitfield, there are aspects of this situation that are classified far above your clearance level. What I can tell you is that your actions have potentially compromised ongoing security operations and created diplomatic complications that could have serious consequences for the monarchy's relationships with foreign governments." A mention of foreign governments and diplomatic complications sent a chill through Thomas. He had assumed the package contained domestic correspondence or internal royal family matters. The suggestion of international implications made his unauthorized delivery seem far more serious than simple insubordination. He began to wonder if his principled stand might have inadvertently caused genuine harm to British interests. Inspector Davies opened a new section of her file and laid out several photographs on the desk. They showed Thomas's vehicle arriving at Catherine's residence, his entry into the building, and his departure approximately an hour later. The surveillance was comprehensive and professional, leaving no doubt about his actions or timeline. Thomas realized that every moment of his unauthorized visit had been documented and analyzed. "Sergeant Whitfield," Inspector Davies said, pointing to the photographs, "these images raise additional questions about your visit with Princess Catherine. Security protocols require that any unauthorized contact with members of the royal family be reported immediately, yet our records show no communication from Princess Catherine's security detail about your visit. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Thomas considered his response carefully, knowing that anything he said about Catherine's reaction to the package could potentially implicate her in his unauthorized actions. He had no desire to cause problems for her beyond whatever complications his delivery of the package might have already created. "Inspector, I cannot speak for Princess Catherine's security team or their reporting procedures. I can only confirm that I delivered the package as I stated yesterday." Director General Thornton leaned forward, his expression growing more intense. "Sergeant Whitfield, let me be absolutely clear about the gravity of this situation. We have evidence that Princess Catherine has already begun acting on information contained in the package you delivered. Her subsequent communications and activities suggest that the contents were both significant and actionable. Your decision to ignore orders has set in motion a chain of events that could have far-reaching consequences." The revelation that Catherine had already acted on the package's contents surprised Thomas and made him realize how little he had understood about what he was setting in motion when he made his decision. He had assumed that delivering the package would simply give Catherine information she could choose to ignore if she wished. The suggestion that she had taken immediate action based on its contents implied that the information was both credible and urgent. Furthermore, Director General Thornton continued, "We have reason to believe that the package was part of a deliberate attempt to manipulate Princess Catherine and potentially destabilize her position within the royal family. By delivering it against explicit orders, you may have unwittingly assisted in what amounts to a sophisticated intelligence operation, designed to exploit internal royal dynamics." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of Thornton's words sank in. The possibility that he had been manipulated into serving someone else's agenda, that his principal decision might have been exactly what unknown actors had hoped for, was devastating. He had prided himself on acting according to his own moral compass, but perhaps he had simply been dancing to someone else's tune. Inspector Davies consulted her notes and posed a new question that seemed to come from an entirely different direction. "Sergeant Whitfield, have you had any contact with foreign nationals in the past 6 months? Any unusual approaches from people claiming to be journalists, researchers, or academic scholars? Any requests for information about royal security procedures or family dynamics?" The question suggested a line of investigation Thomas had not anticipated, implying that investigators suspected his actions might be connected to foreign intelligence operations or other external influences. He thought carefully about his recent interactions, but could identify nothing that seemed suspicious or manipulative. His life had been remarkably routine and insular, focused almost entirely on his professional duties and limited social activities. "No, ma'am," Thomas replied honestly. "I have had no unusual contacts or approaches of any kind. My decision to deliver the package was entirely my own initiative, based on my personal judgment about Princess Catherine's right to receive correspondence addressed to her." He wanted to emphasize again that his actions had not been influenced by external parties, though he was beginning to doubt his own ability to recognize manipulation if it had occurred. Director General Thornton stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray London morning as he considered how to proceed. When he turned back to face Thomas, his expression was grave. "Sergeant Whitfield, the investigation into this matter is just beginning. We need to understand not only your actions but also the origins of the package, its intended purpose, and the potential consequences of its delivery. You will remain suspended pending the completion of this investigation, which may take several weeks or months." The prospect of an extended investigation was daunting, suggesting that Thomas's impulsive decision would have consequences extending far into the future. He had hoped that accepting responsibility for his actions might lead to swift resolution, but it was becoming clear that the situation was far more complex than he had understood when he made his choice to defy orders. Inspector Davies gathered her materials and prepared to conclude the session. Sergeant Whitfield, you are to remain available for further questioning as the investigation proceeds. You are not to leave the Greater London area without permission, and you must report any contact from unknown parties immediately. The restrictions on discussing this matter with family members or colleagues remain in effect. As Thomas prepared to leave, Director General Thornton offered one final comment that seemed both warning and invitation. Sergeant Whitfield, your cooperation with this investigation will be noted in any final determination about your future. If you have withheld any information or if additional details occur to you, I strongly encourage you to come forward voluntarily rather than wait for us to discover discrepancies. The walk back to the building's lobby felt surreal, as if Thomas were moving through a world that had suddenly become foreign and threatening. The gray morning light seemed harsher than usual, and the anonymous faces of other government workers appeared suspicious and judgmental. He realized that his simple decision to follow his conscience had thrust him into a world of intelligence operations and international complications that he was utterly unprepared to navigate. Outside the building, Thomas stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, trying to process everything he had learned during the interview. The package he had delivered to Catherine apparently contained information significant enough to trigger immediate action on her part, and sophisticated enough to potentially represent foreign manipulation. His principled stance now seemed naive and possibly dangerous. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast as Thomas began the long walk back to his flat. He needed time to think, to process the implications of what he had learned, and consider how his simple act of moral courage had become entangled in forces far larger and more dangerous than he had imagined. The satisfaction he had felt about following his conscience was now tempered by fear that he might have been manipulated into serving interests hostile to everything he had spent his career protecting. 3 days after his intensive interview with Inspector Defies and Director General Thornton, Thomas Whitfield sat in his cramped flat watching the morning news with growing unease. The lead story was about Princess Catherine's unexpected cancellation of several official engagements, citing the need to address urgent personal matters. The reporter's careful language and the palace's terse statement suggested there was more to the story than was being publicly disclosed. Thomas knew with sickening certainty that Catherine's sudden change in schedule was connected to the package he had delivered. Whatever information it had contained was clearly significant enough to disrupt her carefully planned royal duties, and that realization made him question his decision in ways that kept him awake at night. He had wanted to give her the right to choose whether to receive the correspondence, but he had never considered that the choice might come with such serious consequences. His phone rang during the midday news displaying Inspector Defies' number. Thomas answered with trepidation, knowing that contact from the investigation team rarely brought good news for someone in his position. Her voice was crisp and professional as she requested his immediate presence at headquarters for what she described as urgent developments in the case. The journey to Internal Affairs headquarters felt different this time, charged with an anxiety that went beyond his personal circumstances. Thomas found himself studying the faces of other passengers on the tube, wondering if any of them might be connected to the mysterious package or the forces that had apparently used him to manipulate Princess Catherine. The paranoia was unfamiliar and unwelcome, but he could not shake the feeling that he was now part of something much larger and more dangerous than he understood. Inspector Defies was not alone when Thomas arrived at her office. Seated across from her desk was a woman he did not recognize, someone whose expensive suit and confident bearing suggested senior government authority. The woman's presence immediately elevated the tension in the room, and Thomas realized that his case had attracted attention from departments beyond Royal Protection Services. Sergeant Whitfield. Inspector Defies began without preamble. I would like you to meet Deputy Director Sarah Chen from the Security Services. Recent developments in our investigation have revealed aspects of your case that fall under her jurisdiction. The introduction confirmed Thomas's growing suspicion that his simple act of conscience had somehow become entangled with national security concerns. Deputy Director Chen studied Thomas with the sort of professional assessment that made him feel transparent and vulnerable. Her questions began immediately, focusing on details of his background and personal relationships that seemed far removed from his decision to deliver the package. She wanted to know about his financial situation, his family connections, his social activities, and his access to sensitive information throughout his career. Sergeant Whitfield, Deputy Director Chen said after 20 minutes of background questions. "We have discovered that the package you delivered to Princess Catherine originated from a source with connections to a foreign intelligence service. The information it contained appears to have been specifically designed to provoke the exact response we have observed from Princess Catherine." Thomas felt his stomach lurch at this confirmation of his worst fears. The possibility that he had been manipulated into serving foreign interests was devastating, calling into question not only his judgment but his fundamental understanding of the situation he had stumbled into. He had acted on principle, but those principles had apparently been exploited by people with far less noble intentions. "Sir?" Thomas asked carefully. "Are you suggesting that my decision to deliver the package was somehow predicted or encouraged by foreign actors? Because I can assure you that I had no contact with anyone who might have influenced my actions." He wanted to make absolutely clear that whatever manipulation might have occurred had been subtle enough to escape his notice. Deputy Director Chen exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Davies before responding. "Sergeant Whitfield, sophisticated intelligence operations often rely on exploiting the predictable behavior of well-meaning individuals. Your service record suggested that you might be exactly the type of person who would prioritize personal conscience over institutional loyalty under the right circumstances." The suggestion that his personality and moral framework had been analyzed and exploited made Thomas feel sick with self-doubt. Everything he had believed about his autonomous decision-making now seemed naive and foolish. He had prided himself on acting independently, but apparently he had simply performed exactly as unknown puppet masters had anticipated. Inspector Davies opened a new file and withdrew several photographs that she placed on the desk facing Thomas. The images showed the original package from various angles, revealing details that had not been apparent during his brief examination. Most disturbing were close-up shots of the address label, which appeared to have been created using sophisticated printing techniques that suggested professional intelligence tradecraft. Furthermore, Deputy Director Chen continued, "Our analysis of the package's contents has revealed information that appears to be partially fabricated or deliberately distorted. Whoever created these materials invested considerable effort in making them appear authentic while ensuring they would provoke specific reactions from Princess Catherine." Thomas stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile this revelation with his memory of Catherine's composed but clearly concerned reaction to the package's contents. If the information was fabricated, why had she responded so immediately and dramatically? Either the deception was extraordinarily sophisticated, or there were elements of truth mixed with the false information to make it credible. "What kind of information are we talking about?" Thomas asked, knowing he might not receive a complete answer, but needing to understand the scope of what he had unknowingly facilitated. The investigators exchanged another glance before Deputy Director Chen provided a carefully edited response. The package contained documents and photographs purporting to show evidence of financial irregularities and undisclosed relationships involving members of the royal family, she said. The materials were sophisticated enough to appear credible upon initial examination, but detailed analysis has revealed inconsistencies that suggest deliberate fabrication. The mention of financial irregularities and undisclosed relationships made Thomas understand why Catherine had reacted so strongly to the package's contents. Such allegations, even if ultimately false, would require immediate investigation and potentially damage control. His decision to deliver the materials had forced her into a defensive position regarding matters that might be entirely fabricated. Deputy Director Chen leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "Sergeant Whitfield, Princess Catherine's reaction to these materials has already created complications that extend beyond the royal family. Foreign media outlets have somehow learned of her changed schedule and are beginning to speculate about internal royal difficulties. This suggests a coordinated campaign designed to damage the monarchy's reputation." Thomas began to understand the true scope of what his decision had set in motion. He had not simply delivered unwanted information to Catherine. He had apparently triggered a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to exploit internal royal dynamics and damage the institution's credibility. His conscience had been weaponized against everything he had spent his career protecting. "The question now," Inspector Davies interjected, "is whether your involvement was entirely unwitting or whether you were somehow compromised prior to your decision to deliver the package." We need to examine every aspect of your recent activities to determine if you were targeted for recruitment or manipulation. The suggestion that he might have been deliberately compromised was both insulting and terrifying. Thomas had always prided himself on his integrity and judgment, but now investigators were suggesting that his most fundamental decision-making processes might have been influenced by hostile actors. The possibility undermined his confidence in every choice he had made in recent months. Deputy Director Chen produced another file containing what appeared to be surveillance photographs and communication intercepts. Sergeant Whitfield, we have evidence of unusual activity in your neighborhood and workplace in the weeks leading up to your decision to deliver the package. While we have found no direct contact between you and known intelligence operatives, the pattern suggests you may have been under observation. Thomas studied the surveillance images, recognizing familiar locations around his flat and workplace, but unable to identify anything that had seemed suspicious at the time. The possibility that he had been watched and analyzed without his knowledge was deeply unsettling, suggesting a level of professional intelligence activity that he was completely unprepared to detect or counter. Moreover, Deputy Director Chen continued, our investigation has revealed that similar packages were apparently prepared for delivery to other members of the royal family, but these were successfully intercepted before reaching their intended recipients. Your decision to ignore orders appears to have been the only successful delivery in what was apparently a broader campaign. This revelation was perhaps the most disturbing yet, suggesting that Thomas's actions had been the weak link in an otherwise effective security response to a coordinated attack on the royal family. His colleagues had successfully prevented other deliveries, but his misguided principles had allowed one crucial package to reach its target and achieve whatever destabilization its creators had intended. Inspector Davies consulted her notes before posing a question that seemed to come from an entirely different direction. Sergeant Whitfield, during your career in royal protection, have you ever had doubts about specific orders or policies? Have you ever discussed with colleagues the tension between personal conscience and institutional loyalty? The question seemed designed to explore whether Thomas's decision had been the culmination of long-standing philosophical differences with royal protection protocols. He considered his response carefully, knowing that admitting to previous doubts might suggest a pattern of unreliability, while denying them might appear dishonest given his recent actions. Inspector, Thomas replied honestly, like any thinking person, I have occasionally questioned specific decisions or wondered about alternative approaches to security challenges, but I have never before acted on those doubts or allowed them to influence my professional behavior. My decision to deliver the package was unprecedented in my career. Deputy Director Chen made notes as he spoke, suggesting that his answer would be analyzed for signs of deeper problems or ongoing security risks. Thomas realized that every word he spoke was being evaluated, not just for truthfulness, but for evidence of character flaws or vulnerabilities that might make him unsuitable for future security work. Sergeant Whitfield, Deputy Director Chen said as she gathered her materials. This investigation is expanding beyond your individual actions to encompass the broader intelligence operation that appears to have exploited your decision. You will continue to be a crucial witness in our efforts to understand and counter this campaign. The designation as a witness rather than simply a subject of investigation was somewhat reassuring, suggesting that investigators had concluded his involvement was unwitting rather than deliberate. But it also meant that his ordeal was far from over, as he would apparently remain central to efforts to uncover and disrupt the foreign intelligence operation that had manipulated him. As the meeting concluded, Inspector Davies provided updated restrictions on his activities and communications. The investigation was expanding to include international counterintelligence efforts, which meant increased scrutiny of his contacts and movements. Thomas was beginning to understand that his simple decision to follow his conscience had made him a permanent part of a complex intelligence matter that might take years to fully resolve. The walk back to his flat felt different yet again as Thomas tried to process the revelation that his neighborhood and workplace had been under surveillance by hostile intelligence services. Every face on the street now seemed potentially threatening, every casual interaction potentially significant. His world had become a place where his own judgment could not be trusted, and unknown forces might be manipulating events around him. That evening, as Thomas sat alone in his flat trying to make sense of the day's revelations, He reflected on how completely his life had been transformed by a single decision made in what he had believed was principled solitude. The package he had delivered to Catherine had been just one element in a sophisticated operation designed to exploit the very qualities he had always considered his greatest strengths: his integrity, his loyalty to individuals over institutions, and his willingness to act on moral conviction. The irony was almost overwhelming. In trying to protect Catherine's autonomy and right to information, he had made her a target of foreign manipulation. In acting according to his conscience, he had served interests hostile to everything he believed in. His greatest act of moral courage had become his most significant failure, and he was only beginning to understand the full scope of the damage he had unwittingly helped to cause. 2 weeks after learning that he had been unwittingly manipulated by foreign intelligence services, Thomas Whitfield received an unexpected phone call that would change everything once again. The caller identified himself as private secretary to Princess Catherine, and his message was both surprising and urgent. Princess Catherine requested a private meeting with Thomas that evening at a location away from her official residences. The request came through unofficial channels and with explicit instructions that Thomas was not to inform the investigation team about the meeting until afterwards. This created an immediate dilemma for someone already under intense scrutiny for violating official protocols. But something in the secretary's tone suggested that Catherine had discovered information that might be crucial to understanding the broader situation they had both become entangled in. Thomas spent the afternoon wrestling with the decision of whether to attend the meeting. His restrictions explicitly forbade unauthorized contact with members of the royal family, and violating them again would almost certainly result in criminal charges rather than just administrative discipline. But the possibility that Catherine had learned something important about the package and its origins made the risk seem worthwhile. The meeting location was a private club in Mayfair that Catherine sometimes used for confidential discussions away from official settings. Thomas arrived precisely at the appointed time, using a service entrance to avoid the main reception area where his presence might be noted and reported. The elaborate precautions suggested that Catherine understood the sensitive nature of their situation and the potential consequences of their meeting. Catherine was waiting in a small private dining room, dressed casually but maintaining the composed demeanor that never seemed to leave her even in the most difficult circumstances. She gestured for Thomas to take a seat across from her at a table that had been set for two, though neither of them showed any interest in the food that had been prepared. Her first words immediately confirmed Thomas's suspicion that she had discovered significant information. "Sergeant Whitfield," Catherine began without preamble, "I owe you an apology. When you delivered that package to me 2 weeks ago, I believed you were making a principled decision to ensure I received information intended for me. I now understand that we were both manipulated by people with far different intentions than either of us realized." Thomas felt a mixture of relief and continued concern at her words. Relief because Catherine understood that his actions had been well-intentioned, but concern because her phrasing suggested she had learned disturbing details about the manipulation they had both experienced. He waited for her to continue, knowing that whatever she had discovered would probably be both illuminating and troubling. Catherine reached into a folder beside her chair and withdrew several documents that looked official and heavily classified. "After receiving your package, I began my own investigation into its contents and origins. What I discovered is that the information was part of a sophisticated operation designed not just to damage the royal family, but to identify and exploit specific vulnerabilities in our security protocols." She explained that her own intelligence contacts had helped her trace the package's origins through international channels that were beyond the reach of domestic security services. The trail led to a network of operatives working for a foreign government with interests in destabilizing British institutions and creating internal conflicts within the royal family that could be exploited for propaganda purposes. "The most disturbing aspect," Catherine continued, "is that the operation specifically targeted you as the weak link in our security chain. Your psychological profile, your service record, your personal values, all of this was analyzed to determine that you would be the most likely person to act on conscience rather than follow orders under the right circumstances." Thomas felt sick as the full scope of his manipulation became clear. Every aspect of his personality and professional history had been studied and weaponized against him. His integrity had become a liability, his principles had been turned into tools for hostile intelligence services, and his most admirable qualities had made him the perfect unwitting agent for foreign interests. Catherine's investigation had revealed that the operation extended far beyond the single package he had delivered. The goal was to create a cascade of internal royal conflicts and security breaches that would undermine public confidence in the monarchy and create opportunities for further intelligence penetration. Thomas's decision to deliver the package had been just the first step in a much larger campaign. However, Catherine said, her tone becoming more determined, I believe we have an opportunity to turn this situation to our advantage. The people behind this operation expect us to react defensively and predictably to their manipulation. Instead, I propose we use their own tactics against them. She outlined a plan that was both audacious and risky. Rather than simply allowing the investigation to proceed through normal channels, Catherine wanted to feed false information back through the same networks that had targeted Thomas, creating confusion and forcing the hostile operatives to reveal themselves through their responses to deliberately planted intelligence. Thomas listened with growing amazement as Catherine described her proposal. She had clearly thought through every aspect of the plan, anticipating potential complications and developing contingencies for various scenarios. Her approach demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of intelligence operations, but surprised someone who had known her primarily in ceremonial contexts. The key element, Catherine explained, is that this operation requires someone with legitimate access to royal protection protocols, but who appears to have been compromised by the original manipulation. You are the perfect candidate to serve as our double agent, feeding information to the hostile network while actually serving our counterintelligence objectives. The proposal was stunning in its implications. Catherine was asking Thomas to deliberately appear to betray his oath and his country while actually serving a deeper loyalty to both. The plan would require him to convincingly portray someone who had been successfully recruited by foreign intelligence while actually working under official direction to expose and disrupt the hostile network. Thomas considered the proposal carefully, understanding both its potential value and its enormous risks. If successful, it could expose a significant foreign intelligence operation and protect the royal family from future manipulation. But if discovered or unsuccessful, it would confirm every suspicion investigators had about his loyalty and result in charges far more serious than his original insubordination. Ma'am, Thomas said finally, such an operation would require official authorization and support that I'm not sure we can obtain given my current status. The investigation team already suspects I may have been compromised, and convincing them that I should be used as a double agent seems unlikely. Catherine smiled for the first time during their conversation, suggesting she had anticipated this concern and developed a solution. Sergeant Whitfield, I have been in contact with certain elements within the security services who understand the value of unconventional approaches to counterintelligence. Your apparent compromise makes you more valuable as an asset, not less. She explained that a small group within the intelligence community had been tracking the foreign operation for months without being able to penetrate it effectively. Thomas's unwitting involvement had actually provided them with their first real opportunity to establish contact with the hostile network and begin feeding it false information. His previous actions, rather than being simply mistakes, could now serve as credentials that would make him credible to foreign recruiters. The plan required Thomas to gradually establish contact with the people who had manipulated him, allowing them to believe they were successfully recruiting him while actually working under deep cover to expose their operations. Catherine's role would be to provide authentic-seeming information that could be shared with the hostile network while actually serving British counterintelligence objectives. The beauty of this approach, Catherine continued, is that your genuine emotional reaction to learning about the manipulation will be entirely authentic. The anger and disillusionment you feel about being used can become the foundation for a credible recruitment by hostile services, even though you will actually be serving our interests. Thomas began to understand the psychological sophistication of what Catherine was proposing. His real emotions about being manipulated could serve as convincing evidence of his vulnerability to foreign recruitment, while his actual loyalty remained unchanged. The operation would require him to live a lie so convincing that even he might sometimes struggle to remember which side he was really serving. The conversation continued for another hour as Catherine outlined the operational details and security measures that would protect them if the plan went wrong. Thomas would be provided with a handler from the counterintelligence service who would coordinate his activities and ensure that any information he provided to hostile operatives served British interests rather than foreign ones. "Sergeant Whitfield," Catherine said as their meeting concluded, "I understand that I am asking you to risk everything again, this time deliberately rather than inadvertently. But I believe this may be our only opportunity to protect not just the royal family, but other potential targets of this foreign intelligence network." Thomas felt the weight of another impossible decision settling on his shoulders. 2 weeks ago, he had risked his career to follow his conscience. Now, Catherine was asking him to risk his freedom and possibly his life, to serve his country in ways that would appear treasonous to anyone not aware of the true nature of his mission. The drive back to his flat gave Thomas time to process the extraordinary conversation and the choice he now faced. Catherine's proposal offered him a chance to redeem his earlier mistake and serve his country in a way that might actually matter. But it also required him to enter a world of deception and betrayal that he was completely unprepared for. That evening, as Thomas sat alone considering Catherine's proposal, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since his simple decision to deliver a package. He had gone from being a reliable security officer to an unwitting foreign asset to a potential double agent in the span of just 2 weeks. Each choice had seemed clear in the moment, but the consequences had extended far beyond anything he could have predicted. The phone call came at 10 o'clock that night. Thomas recognized Inspector Davies's voice, but her tone was different than usual, urgent rather than official. "Sergeant Whitfield, we need to meet immediately. There have been developments in your case that change everything. Can you come to headquarters within the hour?" As Thomas prepared to leave his flat, he realized that Catherine's proposed operation might already be in motion. The investigation team's urgent summons suggested they had learned about their meeting or discovered new information about the foreign intelligence network. Either way, his quiet life of suspension and uncertainty was about to become much more complicated. The night air was crisp as Thomas made his way through London's empty streets toward what might be his final meeting as a suspended security officer. By tomorrow, he might be a recruited foreign agent, a British counterintelligence operative, or a prisoner facing charges of treason. The only certainty was that his simple decision to follow his conscience 2 weeks ago had set in motion events that were now far beyond his control. As he approached the headquarters building, Thomas thought about the oath he had sworn 20 years earlier to protect the crown and serve his country. That oath had seemed straightforward then, requiring nothing more complicated than following orders and maintaining professional standards. Now it was about to require him to betray everything he appeared to believe in order to serve something more important than appearances. The security guard at the entrance looked surprised to see Thomas arriving so late, but Inspector Davies's authorization allowed him immediate access to the building. As he walked through corridors that had once felt like home, Thomas realized he was probably seeing them for the last time as the person he had been. Whatever emerged from the meeting ahead would be someone different, either someone broken by the consequences of his choices or someone reborn through service to purposes larger than personal comfort. Inspector Davies was waiting with a small group of people Thomas didn't recognize, their serious expressions and the late hour suggesting that whatever they had discovered was both urgent and significant. As Thomas took his seat in the familiar conference room, he understood that his journey from loyal security officer to reluctant participant in international intelligence operations was about to reach its next crucial phase. The choices ahead would define not just his own future, but potentially the security of everyone he had spent his career protecting.